Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the OFN Today on the Lads Football Network as we talk Seattle Seahawks football with Corbin Smith joining us once again. And Corbin covers the Seahawks for Seahawks Maven SI, is a reporter for that website and also the host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast. Corbin's been with us several times before, and I'm glad that he's back again as a newly engaged, no longer single male in the great Northwest. How you doing, Corbin?
I'm pretty good. It was a fun last couple days. We'll just put it that way.
I can imagine. Yes, congratulations. All
Thanks,
right.
I appreciate it.
You got it. All right, Corbin. So let's start with the big one. Let's start with Russell Wilson. We have to start with Russell. Tell me what's going on.
I don't really think there's near as much going on as what a lot of the big media are trying to let on here. I mean, if you look at what Russell Wilson said, it was something that was pretty surprising because typically Russell Wilson has not come out publicly and been speaking out against the team, but that is what happened. He was talking about the pass protection issues, and if you have followed the Seahawks over the years, you know that Russell Wilson has absolutely been under duress more than any quarterback in football, and not all of that is on the offensive line. The style quarterback that he is, he loves to extend plays. He hangs on to the football for a long period of time. That is going to open the door for getting hit by NFL pass rushers and going to get sacked more often as a result of that. It's a double-edged sword. He's going to make some big plays for you with his ability to extend broken plays, get outside the pocket, but he's also going to take more hits. That being said, most of his career he has had a very suspect offensive line in front of him. I don't know last year that was the case, though. This is a team that finished ninth in ESPN's pass block win rate metric, and that's based on the percentage of the time they were able to hold their blocks for 2.5 seconds or longer. So they were one of the top 10 teams in the NFL for that last year. It just seemed like, unfortunately, late in the season, this offensive line struggled more than they did the first half when this offense was putting up historic point totals. They just weren't able to keep that going in the second half, and they weren't able to make the adjustments that they needed to make. And so obviously Wilson is frustrated. He's going to be 33 next November, and so I think he's looking at Tom Brady winning another Super Bowl and thinking, you know, that's what I want to be. I want to be that quarterback playing well into my 40s and still competing for titles. And he just feels like that window isn't being taken advantage of right now. And so I don't think he wants out of Seattle. I don't think he wants the Seahawks to trade him, at least right now. But he is clearly sending the message to John Schneider and Pete Carroll that if things don't get better, you guys don't do a better job of going out and getting linemen that can protect me, and we aren't able to make a deeper run in the playoffs, then my stance on this could change in the future. A year or two from now, I might demand a trade and want to be out of here because you guys have not done what needed to be done to really compete for Super Bowls and really enhance my legacy as one of the best quarterbacks of my era. And so I understand where Wilson's coming from. I didn't necessarily like how he threw the offensive line under the bus. I know a lot of former Seahawks linemen have come out, Walter Jones being one of them, saying he should have kept that in-house. But certainly you can understand his frustrations, and he wants to win. This is a team that's only gotten past the first round of the playoffs twice in the last 5 years. And when you consider you have Wilson under center and all the talent they have around him, that seems like that's inexcusable. This is a team that should have been able to at least get back to one NFC championship game during that span, and it hasn't happened. And so that's really where the root of the frustration comes into play. They're not going deep enough in the playoffs. He was at the Super Bowl. You could tell when they zoomed in with the camera during the broadcast that he wasn't super enthused about what was going on there. He wants to be on the field playing in that game. And so all these things add up. You've got a quarterback that is starting to really get frustrated. He's starting to wield some of the power that comes with being a franchise quarterback. And it starts to become a little bit scary when that happens and you're a GM or you're a head coach like Pete Carroll and John Schneider. You're now looking at the prospects potentially of having a disgruntled player that if you don't go out and make the moves necessary to improve this football team and get back to playing for Super Bowls, that you might just alienate him enough that he says, you know what, enough's enough. I'm ready to make my way out of Seattle. I don't think he has a foot out of the door right now, though. I think that that's been exaggerated.
All right, well, obviously I want you on this show because it is the offseason. Free agency hasn't even begun yet, so I want to be able to go over the roster and so forth and salary cap. But quickly before we move on, though, the Brian Schottenheimer situation, if you take a look at last year, they were still more conservative, but that was almost, again, by design. That was what the instruction was. And he threw, a career low 5 interceptions. The offense seemed to play better because they were able to run the football. This year, it was like, we have to start opening it up more. So they start opening it up more. As you mentioned, the numbers were incredible the first half of the season. The passing game was just incredible. As a matter of fact, he threw a career high touchdown passes and interceptions in the same season. His completion percentage was at an all-time best, even though his yards gained per completion was a career low. Then they fire Schottenheimer. And Russell Wilson apparently, now whether or not he truly was not happy with that, and I don't know if that was part of his unhappiness when he came out and spoke, but were you surprised that Schottenheimer was fired? Was he a scapegoat?
I think scapegoat is the perfect term. I've talked about this in a few other radio shows that I've been on recently, that I think when you just look at the way things played out the last couple of months, there was a lot of different things at play here. I don't think Russell Wilson was playing good football for most of that stretch. So certainly the quarterback's got to be held accountable. I think Pete Carroll was meddling a little bit into the offense, although the narrative that they suddenly started running the ball a bunch again is completely not true. Brian Schottenheimer was still dialing up a bunch of pass plays for Russell Wilson the last 2 months. It just wasn't working like it was at the beginning of the season. And teams started to play two deep coverages more against them. And it just didn't seem like the Seahawks were able to make adjustments. I don't think that's all on Brian Schottenheimer, though, because you go back and you watch the film, and there were certainly some plays that Russell Wilson had receivers open, and he just was gun shy. He wasn't getting rid of the football. So that, to me, goes back to what Pete Carroll was starting to do middle of the season. He had a couple games where Russell Wilson threw a bunch of interceptions, and he told reporters that he told Russell Wilson, hey, we got to protect the football. I think that they overcorrected a little bit. It ended up impacting Russell Wilson's performance as well. And so I do think at the end of the day, Brian Schottenheimer, the second half of the season, was still wanting to wing the ball around the field. And I don't know that Pete Carroll appreciated that, because Carroll said several times in the second half, we got to get back to running the football. And they just were never able to really do that. There was not a concerted effort to really emphasize that ground game. And it ended up being something that I think really hurt this offense down the stretch. They said there were philosophical differences that led to Brian Schottenheimer leaving Seattle. To me, that has to be at the cusp of it, is the fact he wanted to throw the ball more with his star quarterback, and Pete Carroll wanted to go back to a more old school approach. And so there certainly were some reasons that you could consider firing him that were justified. But I think when you consider how good the offense was, all 3 seasons that he was calling plays, it's understandable, too, why some might be a bit baffled why they decided to make that move and now go to Shane Waldron as the new play caller. I can tell you that Russell Wilson was up front with the reporters and the season press conference that he was not on board with Brian Schottenheimer being fired. He admitted that to us. He said that was not his decision to make, but he was not on board with that. And from what I've been told, I've talked to a bunch of different sources about his thoughts on Waldron. He's made some comments last week that he was really excited about working with him. He thinks Waldron is going to be a really good offensive coordinator. He was the best pick out of the coaches they had a chance to interview.
Okay.
But I've also been told by a few sources that there were a few coordinator prospects that Russell Wilson had at the top of his list the Seahawks did not interview. And so really the assessment on Waldron was that it was kind of a lukewarm selection. He was the best of the pack, but there may have been some other coaches that he had interest in Seattle looking at that they didn't even interview. And so we're just going to have to see what this offense looks like. We don't know how much of this is going to be Rams moving to the Pacific Northwest, how many wrinkles from Sean McVay's offense are going to now be part of Seattle's offense. We don't know if it's going to be like 3 years ago where Schottenheimer took 70% of the former playbook from Darrell Bevell and then just added a few of his own things. Who knows?
Yeah.
They've been very quiet about that, which is understandable. They're not going to come out and say, oh, we're going to do this. They're not going to give you the details. But we won't know until they're on the practice field and we start seeing the offense take shape what kind of an attack this is going to be with Waldron now as the play caller.
All right, now, since we're on the subject of coaching changes, explain to me what happened here with the special teams unit, because Schneider left early in the season. Izzo took over, And I think this was something that we talked about early in the season. I was going over my notes, and I recall us talking about how the return unit specifically hadn't been good, and it still really is the weak spot of the unit. But all of a sudden, after not really having a top overall unit for a little bit, they turned into maybe one of the top 5 special teams units this past year, with the combination of Jason Myers not missing a kick and Michael Dickinson, who was a 5th-round pick just a couple of years ago, was really good on a net average last year, really good again this year, but then everything else skyrocketed as well, turning into one of the best punters in the NFL. So was this more of Larry Izzo turning this unit around, and now this is clearly his group?
Yeah, I think Izzo deserves all the credit because they didn't add a lot of new players on special teams necessarily. It's just the players that they had in place. They just executed better on the field. Again, you mentioned Jason Myers. He was Mr. Automatic last season, and he ended up breaking Olindo Mare's record for the most field goals made consecutively by a Seahawks kicker. He still has that streak going intact going into the 2021 season. Michael Dixon's been one of the best punters since they drafted him. He was an all-pro selection as a rookie 3 years ago. He's been the best draft pick they had in that 2018 class. So he's been fantastic. He had another really good season. And I think what was really the difference maker for them on special teams, their kick and punt coverage was so much better this year. You had a Pro Bowler in Nick Bellore who had a fantastic season, racked up a bunch of tackles. Cody Barton hasn't necessarily impressed on defense, but he has become a special team standout on punt and kick coverage. And then they get DJ Reed, who not only played well on defense when he was thrown into the lineup with some guys injured around him, played him at outside corner, he also gave him a lift in the second half of the season, returning kicks and punts. And so everything across the board improved for the Seahawks on special teams. And a good majority of those players are under contract for next season, and Izzo is now the full-time special teams coach. They couldn't go back to Schneider at this point. They had to keep Izzo in there with the job that he did, and it's not surprising when you consider how great of a special teams player that he was on the field, playing in the AFC East, and he has translated that to his coaching, and absolutely the most improved part of this football team in 2020.
But that is definitely something. Now, I don't know how much, like you said, everybody's coming back, and there are a lot of other needs for this team. But they'd like to have that. The return game needs to be better. It hasn't really been good for several seasons.
It hasn't, and they moved away from Tyler Lockett finally. That was something that I argued for a couple of years. You can't have your number one or number 2 receiver back there constantly taking hits on special teams, even though he was pleading with coaches to continue doing that. Of course he's going to. He wants to be on the field as much as he can, but they finally were able to do that in large part because of the presence of DJ Reed. They had David Moore back there before, and he did okay. Not necessarily great as a kick and punt returner, but they had some pieces in place. They could finally move away from Tyler Lockett. So I think we're done seeing Lockett in that capacity for the most part. He's done on special teams, and Reed's going to be under contract next year. So he has a chance potentially still be that guy. Maybe they bring in another player in the draft that's got some kick and punt return capabilities. But I think they have the right coach now in place in Larry Izzo. We saw everything improve last season. That is the one area that he's going to be looking at saying, how can we get more productivity from our kick and punt return game? We started to see in the second half. Maybe that trend will continue to go upward in 2021.
All right, now let's overview. Seahawks, just 4 picks. Of course, the Jamal Adams trade has a lot to do with this, but the first pick is 56, round 2. Then there's a 4th, a 5th, and a 6th. There's only 4 picks, but we know John Schneider is going to do whatever he can to add picks at some point this year. The cap space is somewhere in the middle in the NFL, so it's not terrible, but it's not great. Matter of fact, there's some interesting free agents, as always, KJ Wright, Irvin, Mayowa, and a few others, Griffin. But what I look at is 2022, and I see, well, Dunlap's getting older. Brown's getting older. He'll be 36. You got Lockett, Reed, Adams, Diggs, Shell, Disley. So there's a lot of guys that are going to have to get paid next offseason. And so Schneider's going, I'm sure, absolutely positive, it's really the strategy has got to be about these next 2 years and what's the plan, who he wants to keep past 2022.
Yeah, there's going to be some really difficult financial obstacles the Seahawks are going to have to overcome, particularly this offseason. This is really the entire league with the salary cap plummeting anywhere between 175, 185 million. It's down significantly because of the pandemic and not having fans in the stands last year. So, but it's interesting. You look at a lot of the other teams, like I'll use an example. The Philadelphia Eagles right now are $49 million in the red over the salary cap. And so a team like that, you're just going to have to do a fire sale just to be able to have a financial situation that is tenable next season. And so obviously they're trying to move Carson Wentz. The Seahawks have been linked to Zach Ertz. I've been confirmed that I have had confirmation on that from sources that the Seahawks have indeed inquired about his availability. But the Seahawks, compared to, say, teams like the Eagles and the Saints that are really in very difficult situations, you're going to have to get rid of a bunch of good players. The Seahawks have some avenues to create cap space. They could turn some of Russell Wilson's base salary into a signing bonus this year. You can make up to $12 million in instant cap space doing that. Hey, you can go get yourself an offensive lineman with that kind of money.
That's right.
And you can protect Russell Wilson better. They could do the same with Bobby Wagner's contract if they wanted to and create some cap space. You mentioned all those players that are going to be up for free agency in 2022. You can extend some of those players right now, and you can structure their contract so that a lot of the cap hit is going to go on the extension years, and you can lower their cap hit for 2021. So there are a lot of avenues the Seahawks can take to create cap space and go out and get players. So I think they're in a better position than a lot of teams are under the current financial climate with the salary cap going down, that they can make some moves. With that said, they're not going to be in a position where they can go out and sign a bunch of big-name free agents either. They're not. I don't know that any team is necessarily positioned to do that. Maybe the Jaguars, because they have no cap on the books and they've been basically tearing down their roster the last 2 years. But most of the teams in the league are going to have to be making financial concessions. There's going to be a lot more veterans that hit the free agent market before this is all said and done, because teams are just trying to get into the black, and a lot of teams right now aren't. So Seattle's offseason plan is certainly going to be complicated by that. They do have more flexibility than a lot of teams. I just don't know how many of their own free agents this year that they're going to be able to retain. Players like Chris Carson, Shaquille Griffin. I get the sense from the conversations that I've had that, especially for a player like Carson, that they would love to bring back. It's all going to depend on what this market plays out like. Nobody knows what teams are going to be willing to spend in free agency, because so many teams right now are just trying to get it to where they have any money to spend to begin with. So who knows what kind of money is going to be thrown to these players, especially a position like running back. Chris Carson might be much more affordable than anticipated. If that's the case, the Seahawks would love to have him back. If another team throws big money at him, I don't see any way that it's going to happen. So it really is an unpredictable free agency, as unpredictable a free agency as I can remember covering the NFL. And especially for the Seahawks, it's going to be very fascinating to see which players Snyder decides to keep and which ones he decides to let go. But there are going to be some big names that have been key contributors on this football team that are going to be wearing a different uniform next year. There's no question about that.
Yeah, it's going to be fun for us fans and members of the media, that's for sure. Let's quickly go through the roster then, because as you said, running back. What if Carson is gone? That's a big hole in the roster. He's a big part of their running game. Hyde's also a free agent. And Penny. I mean, Penny's he hasn't stayed healthy. He's missed 21 of 48 games in his 3 years. He's basically a luxury now, isn't he? If he can stay healthy, great. It's awesome. It's a bonus. But there's no way Seattle can count on that. So if something happens to Carson, the running back position becomes a really big obstacle, a really big hole that they're going to have to fill.
Yeah, I am curious. I've mentioned this with a few other people that I've talked to on radio shows recently, that I am curious about Rashad Penny's fit in Shane Waldron's offense, though, because when you look at what Penny did in college at San Diego State, almost all of their plays were ran under center. They ran an old school style offense. If Waldron is going to do a lot of the same things McVay did with his offense down in LA, I would expect you're going to see more under center formations and single back looks and a lot more outside zone runs. That's going to be the bread and butter if they are copycatting. And I don't know how much we're going to see. Again, that remains to be seen. But if they are going to be adopting a lot of those wrinkles as a big part of this offense, I actually think Rashad Penny is an outstanding fit for that. Again, it all comes back to him being healthy, though.
Yeah.
He just hasn't been able to stay healthy. And unfortunately, when you suffer a torn ACL at the end of a season, it really puts in question your availability for the next season. It's just that kind of an injury. And so they knew there was a chance they weren't going to get very much out of him this year just because of the timetable recovering from that injury. From what I've been told, they still believe that he can be the guy. And again, you'll look at the offensive scheme. If he's going to break out, this would seem to be the scheme that would be best suited for him to do that. And then they like DJ Dallas, too, their fourth-round pick out of Miami from last year, who's a little different style. He's more of a between-the-tackles runner, a little bit of pinball action. He bounces off a guy. He's a really good receiver, a former receiver converted to running back. And so they've got some pieces there. I actually think Alex Collins could come back potentially, too. He ran well in a few games for the Seahawks last year. They might have the backs to be able to cluster together a by-committee approach that is successful, and maybe they could draft another running back as well. There's been some rumors about maybe going after Leonard Fournette in free agency, too. Maybe he's a little bit more affordable than Carson. I mean, there are a lot of moving pieces here. It remains to be seen what they're going to do, but really the biggest domino is Chris Carson, and whatever happens with him, then you'll figure out, is Carlos Hyde coming back? Are they going to go with another veteran? Are they going to go young, pick another back? Or are they going to go with the guys they have on the roster because they still have confidence in Penny? There's a lot of different directions they can go, and I think the change in offensive scheme is going to play a big part in that.
At tight end, with Olsen retired and Hollister a free agent, Parkinson really didn't. He had basically a red shirt. He had the foot injury, but he's still somebody I would assume that the team is looking at as a part of the tight end group. And if that's the case, is it Disley, Parkinson, and maybe they just bring back Hollister on a cheap contract and they're set? Or is that a position that you think is really important for them to find somebody to upgrade? Even Disley, who's a pretty good player, very good blocker, solid all-around tight end, but not a tight end that scares you in the passing game, at least vertically.
This is another situation where a lot of this depends on what Shane Waldron's plan is at the tight end position. Because, again, Sean McVay with the Rams, they use the tight end a lot more in their passing game than what the Seahawks have. Higbee and Gerald Everett put up pretty good numbers the last 2 years in that offense. They were key components in that passing game, a lot of 11 and 12 personnel. The Seahawks are still very high in Colby Parkinson. They got a chance to at least get him on the field some in the second half of the season last year. And so the expectation is he's going to be ready for a big jump in year two. Will Disley played in 16 games for the first time in his career and didn't have the best numbers last season, but there's a lot of optimism that he could go out and have a really big 2021 season as well. That being said, I'll be kind of surprised they bring back Jacob Hollister, because I think that now we know what kind of player he is. He is a move tight end that can do some damage down the seam. He can run routes. He's athletic. He tries as a blocker, but he's not a good blocker. That just isn't his game. He's an undersized tight end. I think with the way that the Rams have used tight ends and the way I expect Waldron to use the position, they're going to want tight ends that are versatile, that can be moved tight ends and go out in the slot, but also can play in line and be blockers. I just don't know that Jacob Hollister can be that player. So I don't see the scheme fit there. I would envision they could go up. Maybe Gerald Everett comes with Waldron to Seattle. Yeah, sure. He's a free agent. Don't think he's going to break the bank. He's a player they could bring in. As I mentioned, Zach Ertz is somebody the Seahawks have inquired about. To me, this looks exploratory in nature more than anything right now, because he's got a big cap hit and he's an aging player coming off an injury-marred season. But he's only 2 years removed from a really good season in 2019. He's been one of the most consistently productive tight ends in the league. He can catch. He can block fairly well. So he would be the type of player that would fit in this system well. If that's a position group that Waldron really wants to feature in this offense, then maybe they will go and make a splash like that. I do anticipate they're going to go out and get somebody, whether that's in free agency or they draft somebody. There's some intriguing tight ends in this draft class that might fit Seattle's scheme as well. I would be surprised if they go with status quo and just bring Hollister back. To me, that would be the fallback option more than anything.
All right, wide receivers. Now, only 4 guys really played that position for the team last year, and that's because Dorsett had the foot injury. He was out all year, so that was just a wasted contract. Nobody knows what's going on with Gordon. Hopefully you can enlighten us. So really it was a four-man show. Metcalf and Lockett were almost out there for every snap. Moore's a free agent and Swain's a rookie. So you've got three guys. But Moore, I would guess the team would like to resign him. You tell me. But I would have to believe that you got to bring in another body or two. It's just four guys. It's just not enough. And if something were to happen at Metcalf or Lockett, then there's a big drop off.
This is a position that I think is a far bigger need than a lot of other people are pointing out, because everyone knows that DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett are stars. Seattle's got two really good receivers for Russell Wilson there, but there was a huge drop-off with that third receiver, particularly in the second half of the season. I think that was part of the issue with the passing game, is when teams were taking away the deep ball for Lockett and Metcalf, it's not that those two weren't able to make plays, but there wasn't another player that could really step up and emerge. Their tight ends didn't do that. Their secondary receivers didn't really jump up and take some of those opportunities against those cover two looks. So to me, this is a position group they do need to add another really solid receiver. I think Freddie Swain showed last year there's potential for him to maybe eventually be a quality number 3 receiver. I just don't think he's at that point yet. It would be nice to see them go out and maybe add another veteran. They could go the draft route as well. This is another really good draft for receivers. I feel like at this point every year, right, because receivers are just coming in better and more prepared each year coming into the league, with colleges airing it out. Just have a lot better players coming in general. But the Seahawks have to do something, and there's a few free agents out there that would make some sense to me. And I mentioned the salary cap issues that teams are dealing with. I think there's going to be some big-name receivers that don't get paid a lot of money because teams just don't have that money to spend on guys. I've been hammering home the idea T.Y. Hilton is a guy that intrigues me. I think at this stage of his career, he's not going to be your number 1 guy. They don't need him to be. But I think as a number 3 with Lockett and Metcalf, he would be a lot of fun. Even with him now being 31 years old, he still has wheels. He still can make plays downfield. He's always been a underrated, underneath, short, intermediate game receiver. He can play out of the slot and on the outside. If he's available and the price is right, I think it would make a lot of sense to throw a short-term deal at him. And I think Josh Reynolds, that Rams connection again, a player that would know Shane Waldron's offense. I think he would be a guy that makes sense coming off a career high in receptions and receiving yards. You can bring him in seamlessly. He can play the slot. He had over 200 yards after the catch. Those are the kind of players the Seahawks need to be looking at. They've been near the bottom of the league the last 3 years in yards after the catch. They need somebody that you can just put the ball in their hands and they can create. They don't necessarily have that player. DK Metcalf has shown signs of that, but his biggest strength is as a downfield weapon. You don't want to take that away from him. They need somebody that you can get the ball to quick on slants, on bubble screens and stuff. Get the ball in his hands, let him get to work, that can create yards after the catch. Hilton and Reynolds would be 2 players that I think may be affordable that could fill that bill for the Seahawks next season. All right,
we'll keep an eye on that. And I would be shocked if Seattle did not add at least one impact offensive weapon from the Rams. Those connections always seem to work out. All right, offensive line. And the team has Lewis at guard. The tackle situation seems set for this season. So it's about resigning Posick, and also you have the other guard spot, though, seems to be an issue. So do they resign the center? And if they do, is it all about just making sure that you go out and get yourself a big upgrade at one of the guard spots?
I think they've got to figure out a way to make both positions better. I don't know how you do it with their salary cap space. And I was making an argument last week that maybe this is the year John Schneider changes his approach in free agency. And rather than going out and signing a bunch of mid-level guys on bargain deals, which most of them aren't guys that are going to move the needle in terms of going after a Super Bowl, go get that game changer. Go get that difference maker up front. So I'm talking players like Corey Linsley from the Packers, a guy that I don't think Green Bay is going to be able to re-sign because they put a lot of money into other positions. Linsley was an all-pro last year. He's been one of the best centers in football for a long time. He's 30 years old, so he's still in the prime of his career to me for offensive linemen. Still got a lot of good football left in him. That's the kind of player that you got to wonder, Russell Wilson wants protection. what better way to show that you're going to support your quarterback than go get the number one center off the free agent market? Yeah. Maybe you can't sign anybody else big name, but you got yourself a true difference maker up front. Linsley's a guy that makes sense. Joe Thuney from the Patriots would be another one if you want to upgrade at left guard.
He's going to make a lot of money, Thuney.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But my point being,
hey,
maybe
just go
this
out
is the year the Seahawks say, you know what?
Instead of quantity, maybe it's time for quality.
Exactly. Go get yourself a true all-pro caliber lineman that you can put in there, because I think they've got pieces. Dwayne Brown is still a very good player. Damian Lewis had an outstanding rookie season. He's going to be a stud in this league. And Brandon Shell had a really good first year for the Seahawks. He was impressive, especially in pass protection. So they're happy with those three spots. I just think when you look at the center spot, Ethan Posick had a respectable season, but I just don't know how much better he's going to get. And he's not a guy that's going to win consistently in the run game. And we know the Seahawks like running the football. I just feel like they need to get an upgrade at that spot. And left guard, Mike Upati's had a great career, but he's getting old. He's had injury issues. The other players they've got on the roster have had durability concerns, aren't necessarily starter caliber players. So they need to get new players at those two spots. I think the ideal thing would be getting a player like Corey Linsley as center, and then using maybe your first draft pick on a guard, because this is a really good offensive line class. I think the Seahawks at pick 56 could get a quality guard or center if they want to go that route that can start day one. And I get that player and Damian Lewis in the middle under contract for at least 3 years. You would solidify the center of your line for years to come. So they've got options. I just think they need to be more aggressive filling one of those spots in free agency. Go get a proven commodity, because your quarterback wants that. You need to make sure that, and your window is open to win a Super Bowl. Who knows how long that's going to last? You got to take advantage of it now. You're clearly in win now mode getting Jamal Adams. So go get yourself an offensive lineman that's really going to take that unit over to the top and put you in a position to get back to the big game next year.
Yeah, because as we switch over to the defense, boy, the pressure sure went up. After only 28 sacks last season, the team went up to 46. And look, a lot of it had to do with Jamal Adams, who had 9.5 sacks and led the team from his deep patrol area of the. But I'm not sure how often he was in deep patrol, I'll tell you the truth. But that's what makes Jamal Adams a special player, and that helped. Mayowa was a free agent brought over from Las Vegas on a 1-year deal, so he's a free agent again. But he had 6 sacks, so that was nice. Unfortunately, the team lost Bruce Irvin, brought him back. We talked about that in the preseason. It was nice to bring him back. Unfortunately, he tore his ACL in week 2, and he's a free agent again. Poona Ford, boy, he's starting to take off in his career on the interior. He's a restricted free agent, so I'm sure he's not going anywhere. So talk about the defensive line. So even though the sacks went up, there's still some players that they're going to have to take care of. LJ Collier looked a lot better in year 2. He was their first-round pick in 2019. And I absolutely love the trade for Carlos Dunlap. I thought that was a brilliant move. And to have him for another season will also be a pretty big deal for them. So talk about the front 7 or the front 4. Is it really just about maybe re-signing Mayowa and Irvin? Do you think that's the way they go and everything else should be okay?
I'll be really surprised if Bruce Irvin's brought back just because he had a second surgery on his knee. I don't know where he's at as far as recovery goes. And with him being an older player, I think the Seahawks are probably going to go in a different direction. If he wants to come back for near veterans minimum, maybe something comes together late in the offseason, but I don't think there's going to be a rush to strike a deal there. Mayowa, I do think they would love to bring back because he really played well the second half when he was no longer playing 80% of the snaps because Carlos Dunlap was there and he was more fresh. You could just see it in his pass rushing. He really was wreaking havoc late in the season, was getting after quarterbacks, was forcing fumbles, and it was a lot of fun to watch. I think the biggest thing to look at with this defensive line, they've got 2 players in Jaron Reed and Carlos Dunlap who have cap hits around $14 million for 2021. There is no way they're going into next season with those 2 contracts as they stand. They just can't. They can't afford to have that much money locked up in their defensive line. Dunlap, if you get rid of him, there's no dead cap. You would instantly create $14 million in cap space. And so that's kind of an allure right there. Even though he played well in the second half and he gave you a lift, he's an older player. Maybe that would be the right move to make. Let's go take that money and spend it elsewhere. We've got Darrell Taylor coming back. He's going to be healthy after not playing his rookie season. Alton Robinson looked good. So they've got some young pieces that they may be ready to give a more expanded role to next year. So maybe that would be the justification for moving on from Dunlap. As for Jaron Reed, he had 6.5 sacks last year. Most of those came after Carlos Dunlap arrived. It seems like he's a player where he really needs that elite pass rusher on the outside to help him wreak havoc in the interior. And that's not knocking him. I think Jaron Reed's a good player, but he's a player that I would be looking to maybe try to move or restructure his deal, extend him. Maybe they can extend both those players to lower their cap hits. There are options there, but I just don't see any way that those two guys are both under contract for 2021 with their current cap hits. There's going to be something happen on both fronts with both players. We'll have to see what John Schneider decides to do. If I had to hedge bets, I would think the Seahawks would be more willing to move forward without Jaron Reed because they have an undrafted rookie in Cedric Lattimore that has made his debut in the playoffs and played really well. They're high on him. They think he's got a lot of upside. They want to keep Poona Ford around as well. And Brian Monet's got a couple years left under contract. And so I think they feel comfortable with what they have at defensive tackle if they moved on from Reed. I don't know that they would feel that way necessarily without Dunlap, just because there are a lot of question marks with those young players, especially Darrell Taylor, who has yet to play in an NFL game. And so this is going to be fascinating to watch what they choose to do there. And there's going to be a ripple effect. Whatever they decide to do with Dunlap and Reed is going to create financial room to address other positional groups in free agency.
But if they do, and I agree, I think they're going to try and bring back Dunlap on as cheap as they can, like you said. And I think they have an edge because of the fact that Dunlap played his ball in Cincinnati his whole career, a lot of losing there, and he got a taste of a little bit of winning. And, he's on a team with Russell Wilson, so I would think that he'd settle for a little less at this stage of his career. So I could see that happening. I really can. And if that does happen and they can bring back Mayowa, do you think that's it? That Seattle doesn't have to really worry too much about adding anything else up front?
Yeah, I think the only thing they would do from there is maybe use a late round pick. There's a couple guys in the draft that I think will be available day 3. This is an okay defensive line class. It's not one of the best that I've seen, but it's not terrible either. There are some guys on day 3. I actually wrote a piece up on this kid today. Teron Jackson out of Coastal Carolina is a player that I think on day 3 would be a lot of fun to put into Seattle's scheme. But those are the kind of players we're talking about. They're not going to go out and spend a bunch of money on pass rushers if Carlos Dunlap is retained and they bring back Mayowa. They're not going to be looking to sign a bunch of veterans. They don't need them. But I could see them adding one more piece to the puzzle, particularly a player that has 5-tech ability, can play that big defensive end spot, because Rasheem Green's going to be a free agent after this next year and hasn't necessarily shown that he's going to be worthy of getting a second contract up to this point. So they have some question marks down the road to address. I could see him using a late round pick to add more depth, bringing another player with upside. But if they do keep Dunlap, I don't see him being active in free agency at that position.
Okay, at linebacker, KJ Wright, the longest tenured Seahawk. Is he going to be back?
If I had to predict right now, I think KJ Wright is wearing another uniform next year. And I think two big reasons. One, we talked about the salary cap issues they're dealing with. 2, Jordan Brooks is ready for the keys. He is ready to be the full-time weak side linebacker. He was really impressive in the second half of his rookie season. He is going to be a special player. I think he's got Pro Bowl, maybe all-pro ceiling. He's that kind of talent. And so you put him next to Bobby Wagner. KJ Wright's now playing the Sam linebacker spot, so he's only going to be on the field for a certain percentage of plays when they're in their base defense. Otherwise, he's not going to be out there. Last year, they had him stay in during their nickel packages as a weak side backer. They're not going to do that with Jordan Brooks now in 2021. It's going to be his show. And so I don't see how the Seahawks can justify, even though he's earned the money. He deserves to get paid. He had a fantastic season last year.
And he will. He'll probably get paid.
I don't know how the Seahawks can justify paying him when he's not going to be playing more than 50% of the snaps. That he's either going to have to take less to come back, or he's going to be with another team. And I have a feeling he's going to look to last season and say, I'm still a really good player. And he is. So he's going to go get his
Yep.
money somewhere else. That's my
That
prediction
makes
right
sense. All right. And finally, in the secondary, we've already talked about Shaq Griffin. So that would be an important player to bring back. Otherwise, Quentin Dunbar is the only other key piece back there who's a free agent. So everybody else comes back. Is that just all it really is about? Is bringing back Shaq Griffin and maybe trying to upgrade with some veterans or maybe even a draft pick?
This is the position aside from running back. We mentioned Chris Carson earlier, and I've been saying this, I've gotten some flack for it. A lot of people are like, why can't you just make a prediction? But to me, it's a toss-up with Chris Carson. It's 50-50 whether he's back or not. We just don't know what the market's going to look like. Feel the same way with Shaquille Griffin. This is not a great corner free agency class, so that plays into his favor to get paid by somebody. I just don't know if it's going to be the Seahawks. He's had his moments. He was a Pro Bowler 2 years ago, but he hasn't evolved into the shutdown corner that I think the Seahawks thought that he was capable of becoming. And maybe he still can become that player. He's only going to be 26 years old. He's still young. But I just get the sense from the discussions that I've had that they're not going to be willing to break the bank to bring him back on a long-term deal. Even though they really like the kid, they think he's a good player, they don't want to pay him as a great to elite player because he, quite frankly, has not been that. He's been inconsistent in coverage. He had a career high in interceptions last year, but that has not been a strength for him turning the football over. He had some issues with missing tackles. He's missed a few games each of the last couple seasons, so maybe some durability questions as well. So I'm not going to say it's impossible he comes back. The market could dictate that teams aren't going to pay big bucks for him, and the Seahawks could afford to bring him back. We don't know. But if I had to hedge bets there again, I would be actually more inclined to think they bring back Dunbar because he's not going to be getting big bucks with his injury history. You can take a one-year prove-it deal approach with him. Hope his offseason is better than last year. And if that's the case, he comes in better shape. He's shown when he's healthy that he can be a really good corner in this league. You bring him back, they like DJ Reed, and then maybe use one of your picks. This is a really good draft for long, tall, athletic corners, and you know Pete Carroll loves that. And so I think they're going to bring in somebody. They're still going to have Trey Flowers on the last year of his rookie deal as well. He has started a lot of games. He improved as last year went on. So they've got their options. I don't think it's cut and dry that Shaquille Griffin's back in a Seahawks uniform next year. We just have to see what the market looks like.
And how will they run next year, do you think? I mean, basically, they're going to play Diggs, Neal, and Adams a lot. I mean, we know Diggs and Adams are going to play, but Neal will get a lot of playing time, right?
I would think that he's still going to be a player in dime packages like they used him in the second half last year once Adams had come back. He wasn't getting a ton of snaps each game, but he made some big plays for him. There was an interception that Diggs had in the game against the Giants that happened solely because Ryan Neal smacked the tight end Evan Ingram and popped the ball up in the air. I mean, he just made things happen every game he was in. So Ryan Neal is going to be a part of this defense. He's not going to be a starter, but he's going to be one of those key role players that you can bring in sub packages, and he's also going to give you a lift on special teams. He blocked a punt last year, made a bunch of tackles on special teams. So, yeah, they're going to be able to play all three of those players on defense, and they're going to be able to do a lot of really fun stuff in their sub packages because Neal gives you a lot of versatility with his corner background and his ability to play safety as well.
And by the way, Reed and Amadi, they have good futures?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, DJ Reed was maybe the biggest revelation for this football team last year. I mean, I didn't think he was going to play last year. They claimed him off waivers with a torn bicep, and he somehow ended up making it back middle of the season, was healthy, and he just played really good football. He had the lowest passer rating against him of all of Seattle's corners by far, and I think he played a huge role in the fact that the defense played so much better the last 8 games than they were giving up at one point. Less than 14 points per game during the second half of the season. He was a big part of that. Teams were not able to throw over the top against him. He came up and was sticking people. They were blitzing him some. He just gave him a different element. And I think it changed the way Pete Carroll may approach corner from here on out because DJ Reed's 5'9". That is not typically the kind of corner they're going to play on the outside. And yet Pete Carroll was so fired up with the way he played in the second half. I think he's got a very good shot to be one of the 2 starters next season, regardless of what they choose to do with Shaquille Griffin. If they bring Griffin back, I think Reed's probably your other starter there, unless they make a surprise move to bring somebody else in, or Dunbar comes back cheap too. There are some moving pieces, but I think Reed has earned that opportunity to be a starter. And Ugo Amadi, I thought, filled in nicely for Marquise Blair. That said, Marquise Blair is going to come back, and he was maybe the best player not named Russell Wilson in training camp for the Seahawks last year. He was phenomenal on the practice field. So it was disappointing to see him get hurt in week 2. They're very excited to get him back. As much as they like Ugo Amadi, they think Marquise Blair has a higher ceiling in that nickel position because he's bigger, he plays with more physicality, just more versatility to his game even than Amadi has. And so that's going to be a lot of fun to see him come back and hopefully stay healthy so he can build off the strong start he had last year.
Corbin, great job as always. I appreciate it. I look forward to getting the opportunity to talk to you again sometime between free agency and the draft, because once we know how those dominoes fall after free agency, we have a much better idea what the Seahawks are going to be thinking about for the draft, and we'll find out whether or not Schneider can make some moves and add some draft picks. I'm sure Seattle fans would like to have a little bit more excitement for draft day other than 4 picks, but I would think that Schneider's going to pull off some moves and add to that portfolio of draft picks.
I don't see any way the Seahawks make just 4 selections. Yeah. We've seen Schneider turn 4 or 5 picks into 11 a couple of times. Now, he's going to have a much harder time doing that this year because they only have 1 pick the first 3 rounds. It's a second rounder. They don't have the draft capital. They're going to be able to trade down and recoup a bunch of picks. But I could certainly see them trading a player or 2 to get a draft pick. I could see a few trade downs to add some day 3 selections. I'd be surprised if they pick less than 6 times. That would be my prediction right now, at least 6, because John Schneider likes to roll the dice as much as he can. He wants to get a few more darts that he can throw at the board. 4 is just simply not enough.
Corbin, Locked On Seahawks podcast. How often do you do that?
5 days a week, every single weekday, we've got a show. And so a lot of fun. We really enjoy doing it. My co-host Rob Rang and I, again, 5 days a week. We're going to do that throughout the summer. So Seahawks coverage daily. We're really proud of where the show is going and what we've accomplished to this point.
Well, looking forward to talking to you again, like I said, before the draft. So, again, happy engagement. Best of luck there. And we'll talk to you again real soon, Corbin.
Thanks a lot, Greg. I appreciate it.